Let's take a look at this. This is the Invasion of Russia. This is another Europa Simulazione game. So far I've been very happy with the couple of games that I've seen from them, and I'm hoping this one will be as impressive in its own way. Been kind of reading this maybe got me more there, but I've been kind of in the mood for Napoleonic stuff anyhow. So let's take a look at this. The designer contacted me, so this is actually going to be this is a review copy essentially. So, which is very cool. He's also the same designer for something I'm very excited about, and kind of going back and forth about do I need a copy of it, but a game on Blenheim. I had done Famous Victory, Fields of Glory, the old Berg system from Moments in History, and that's terribly flawed, but this one's in pre-order stage from Legion Games. I had originally pre-ordered it, and then when I got something that covered Blenheim, I kind of said, well, I'll put it off. But yeah, if you're interested in the more obscure wars that don't get a lot of coverage, that would be an interesting one to go drop a pre-order on. But let's take a look at what this one's like. Now, as you can see, this is all the invasion taking place, and you have territory running out to St. Petersburg and Moscow, all on a very small map. And again, it's in this nice folio format. I really like this format. And this time, they've got words on the spine, so you can put it in your bookshelf and be able to see what you've got. A lot of nice components for this one. Obviously, the map, it's a heavy-duty stock for it. I haven't completely set up yet. You can take a look at the components. There aren't a lot of pictures available on Board Game Geek, and unfortunately that's still where I go for most of my information. You have one of the player aids here is the turn record track, and a place where you keep combat commands. Now this was when the designer contacted me, he said it was a Zucker-esque design. I'm not seeing it as much in this. I mean, maybe I'm sure there's influence in Zucker's credited, but I'm seeing less of it than in the last thing that I just did, which I have kind of hiding over here. The All Is Lost, Save Honor, also by Europa Civilizations. And let's see, what else do you have? You have another card here which looks pretty useful. I didn't tend to look at it much, but it's got your sequence of play, it's got your movement rules. Ignore strategic movement. It just uses the term strategic for movement, basically, in a lot of ways. And then combat, which is going to be using a very unique system. A very unique system. I sound like board game blogger now. One of those chartless but number crunching type systems, and it's very helpful, I think, to have it all spelled out on something that's an easy reference. Otherwise you're paging through the rules all the time trying to figure out what the hell is going on. And like I said, player turn, the turn record track. On the other side of that is the 1813 campaign, which is an option, and we'll probably be playing with all the options one way or another. You also have cards, and again, like in All Is Lost, Save Honor, you tear them out. They're kind of sturdier than the SPI ones, but still not your poker card type things. Might want to sleeve them just because there's like little ragged edges where they were trimmed out. I probably won't, but just shuffling, especially if this becomes a regularly played game, shuffling a lot can be a problem. I'm not a fan of sleeving, though. I'd rather damage my cards, I guess. A little bit of errata here that comes included. And I think between the errata and the information here, actually, I've been able to figure out all my questions Unfortunately, I read the rules a couple days ago, and they kind of drifted out of my mind, and then I skimmed them again, and, well, we'll work through them here. They're not terribly long. The book is fairly hefty looking, but mainly it's in good stock. By the way, the stock on these guys, there's a little bit of kind of glossy feel to it or something that had me a little worried, but I found they handle pencil just fine. Okay, first thing is the combat units themselves are a little different from what you'll normally see. Here's one here. So every combat unit is basically worth 1 combat strength point, but the number on it is how much space it takes. How big a stack, essentially how big a stack you can create with it in a single hex is going to be based on that number. You're going to be allowed to have 6 stacking points or whatever in a hex, and so this is a conscript unit. It says CONS, and it's got a 2 stacking value. Line at 1.5, and then veterans are going to have 1. So that's going to affect the amount of force you can actually have in a stack. Not quite sure I completely understand the reasoning there, in the sense that, well, look, you can mass so many men into an area, the units are divisional size, but it will allow the stronger units to stack up into bigger stacks. You can see things are pretty dense here. This is mostly set up. I've got the supply to put and a couple of leaders on both sides. On the back side of combat units is a disrupted side. That can happen through combat or through attrition. And they're not going to be able to fight, basically. And they're also more fragile. Combat leaders have a combat rating on them, which is the number expressed on them. And I've got some that wouldn't normally be in the game, like Raevsky here, who's is for an optional rule. And like I said, I'm going to play with the optional rules. The cards are also an optional rule. They may throw in some event-type effects, things that maybe you don't feel like the players should control. But on the other hand, the designer has separated out so that there are purely event cards that are sort of must-plays if you're used to the CDG type thing. This isn't a CDG. This is just a card with some player-controlled events that they're going to be forced to play each turn. Okay. Got nationalities spelled out here for the counters. Okay, sequence of play is over here. So, the first thing you have to do is determine which of your units are in supply and what the effect that is, of not being in supply is. Now, in order to be in supply, and you know what, I don't have the core supply spaces memorized, but in order to be in supply, you basically have to trace a sequence of depots, and these supply markers are going to serve a dual purpose. They can be flipped over in certain conditions, when they're on the top of stacks. One purpose that they can serve is depots, in which case they'll be sitting on the bottom of the stack, and you can trace your general supply through them. And basically, for tracing general supply, you follow the following. You have to trace from a combat unit back to a depot, and then from depots ranging back to your ultimate supply source. You can't go through enemy cities that are unoccupied. And this is enemy being who controls them at the beginning of the game. You can't cross a river except via a bridge, a working bridge. There are some bridge destroyed markers. You can't go through difficult terrain. Now, difficult terrain is defined as forest, marsh, mountain, and or rough. All of those except mountain, the Russians can ignore as difficult terrain. So their supply actually runs through those. And the range from one unit back to a depot or from one depot back to the next depot is generally 5 hexes, but once you hit the winter turns here, which aren't actually marked except by the color, that's sufficient, but elsewhere there's a little W back here. Here there's a little W for it, and I thought I remembered it there. That drops down to only 3 hexes, and you're going to have to be careful. I haven't played it, but I can tell that I'm going to have to be real careful as I get close to winter that I set my supply line up so that it works when we make that transition into the winter phase. Starting on turn 3, each French stack that has a forage marker makes a roll, and forage marker is stacks that don't have, so there's another, yeah, here I am forgetting things. The other use for these is as, what do they call them, supply trains, in which case they're going to be on top of a stack, and there's a couple dummy supply train markers for each player. And you're going to allocate these, and these are a part of your command and control system in this game. You can say, well, it's your supply system. Yes, but your movement is going to be dependent upon these suckers. So starting on turn 3, if the French don't have one of those on them, they're going to get a forage marker, which I don't know. Back here. Yeah. They're going to get a forage marker on top of the unit. And then, in addition to the effects of not having a supply train, which mean you can't move, actually, among other things, you make a roll to see if you're also going to be counted as out of supply. If you're not in supply, you take a disruption. Your unit flips over. If it's a French unit that's already disrupted, it'll be eliminated unless it's a veteran. And the veterans are, well, the guards are all veteran, and a significant number of the other units are also counted as veteran. But there are a lot of line units, obviously, as well. This is not the French army of 1805, but it's also not the French army after the invasion of Russia. What French army? Yeah, exactly. But there was a conscript army that Napoleon managed to raise up to fight the coalition war. So the Russians on their side, when they're out of supply, will take the disruption, but they won't take the elimination if they continue to be out of supply. There's an exception up here in Riga. If you're out of supply in Riga with the Russians, you are not disrupted, but you do take the effect of any other effects of being out of supply. These are checked simultaneously, which is important because if units are going to be eliminated, you can't say, oh yeah, that's gone now. Now I can trace my supply line. Okay. And these are going to change with the advanced rules a little bit. Okay, now remember the word strategic means movement in this game. Not exactly. But in order to do anything with your forces, you have to have one of these supply markers converted over to supply train side on top of a stack. And basically what you get to do is you have a big pile of these. You get to set them up as depots at the beginning of the game, but you want to reserve some of them. That pile, let me see, is tracked here. So for example, the Russians have 11 at the beginning, the French have 14, and then that slowly decreases. Now there are more counters than either side ever has, I believe. Well, the Russians go up a little bit, up to 12, so they may, yeah. My suspicion there, and there are also some additional combat units, is that some of the cards are going to generate some of these additional factors, because I haven't seen anything that indicates them in the rules itself, and I don't want to look through all the cards. I kind of like being surprised by those. Okay, as you start to play your strategic supply markers, you can do various things. The first thing is, if you have a supply train in a hex, you can turn it into a depot at that moment. And that, start extending your supply line to where you need it. You move forward with the supply train, and then I guess it turns into a depot. Okay, then you're going to be allocating your supply trains specifically. And in order to do this, well, you just put them on a stack essentially. But you're going to be allocating them for specific, after you place them, you're going to allocate them to specific actions. Either establishing a depot, rallying a stack, or moving a stack. Now, to establish a depot, you flip the supply train over and you put it under the stack of units. And now it's part of your supply line. You can only do this if you can link it back through the ultimate supply source, and you have to follow the normal movement, the normal supplier rules for that. Okay. You could rally forces, and when you flip over a supply marker to do this, you expend the supply marker, and any forces that are there that were disrupted, if they're accompanied by a commander, are going to be able to go into good order. And then the final thing you can do is you can flip over one of these things to allow your force to move. Now, that is done during this rally and strategic movement, so you're going to be flipping counters over, I think, one at a time to take these different actions. And you alternate, starting with the guy who has the most of those together. And I think this distinguishment is just these are subtasks in this supply rule. Okay. Now, when you want to move, you have to be stacked with a supply train and a commander who hasn't moved for himself or forces yet. And then the commander has the option to travel along with the forces, or he could just stay behind if he wants. The stack that you're going to move has to stay stacked together. Everything in that stack has to be in good order, including things you don't want to move. You can't enter enemy combat units, but you could overrun a depot or a commander. If you overrun a depot, you actually take it away from the enemy. You don't get to keep it, but it's taken away from his permanent supply of depots for the rest of the game. So we're going to have to keep a count of how many depots have been overrun. Good practice seems to be to keep your depots away from the enemy line, but it's possible, especially with some of the Russian roles, that their depots are going to get overrun or attacked with troops on top of them during the course of the initial invasion, and they may end up low on depots because of that. Let's see. If you move next to enemy cav, you won't be able to continue moving unless the enemy cav is disrupted or separated from you by a river. If you start next to enemy cav, you can move away from it, but you can't move directly into another enemy cav zone of control, as it were, although they don't use the term here. Now, I don't think you've noticed it, but there's a lot of cross-referencing in here. I generally like cross-referencing, but there's very little to label the cross-referencing, and that's one of my gripes as of right now, is that I'm reading through it and I see something like, move, does not move strategically this turn. Remember rule this and exception to rule that, and I have to look them up and see what they're about because I have no clues to help me. An extra page that maybe would have been required to put an extra couple words in each of those, Rule 8.9. Well, what's 8.9? 8.9, it's going to be overrunning commanders, so that would be 2 words there. But those do add up. But I find it helpful for context to realize what it's about without having to look it up and find it. And otherwise, I'm left with kind of this blank in my mind, which may be part of why it didn't settle down into my head very well. Oh, la la la. If you're a single combat unit in a city adjacent to a hex containing 2 undisrupted enemy combat units, you're considered to be under siege, and you won't be allowed to move strategically at all unless you're separated from the enemy by a river. Okay. Normally, you're only going to be able to move 3 hexes or 2 in the winter, but you can force march. And here's where I have some iffy things, is the modifier for force march. Basically, when you force march, you're going to make a roll, single die, and you're affected here. And your modifiers are the turn, if you're French, each hex of the forced march. And what wasn't clear until I looked at this picture is, okay, I think what they mean is if I move 4 hexes, I only get a +1 off that. I'm still not positive about it, and it's not cleared up in the errata. But I think this picture kind of makes it clearer in my head. You get a penalty for winter turns, and Napoleon gives a bonus for forces there that are trying to force march. I thought, I think he's not the only one, but okay. La la la. All right. If stacks are at least 2 units, they can take eliminations or other results from here. If it's a single unit, and that's cleared up here, the stack is always disrupted. Artillery and commanders won't be affected by attrition. Okay. On turn 3, like I said, stacks that don't have a supply train, French stacks that don't have a supply train that are in Russia, will end up getting a forage marker on them. And that can cause them a couple of issues here. Unless it's occupying a city or containing a friendly depot that is not under siege. And then here, see some rules that maybe they have to do with that. And that doesn't look like that has anything to do with anything except the general supply over here. All right. And if you overrun an enemy commander, he has a casualty check, I believe. Here we see proceeds as per rule 11.19. Well, we can guess what that's going to be, but we can't be sure. Maybe it's a displacement. A lot of games do things like that. But this is a die roll to see what happens. He might be displaced, he might be killed. Okay. Combat commands. If you want to attack, you have to expend a combat command. And you have a very limited number each turn. They're spelled out here. Are they spelled out anywhere else? Maybe that's the fixed amount per turn. Okay. So yeah, you have a starting number at the beginning of the turn, at the beginning of the game, and that gets changed for each decisive loss or victory that you have. You gain or lose a combat command. A decisive victories, it's based on the number of units that die. So if there's like 3 casualties, I think it's a decisive victory. We'll get that defined later in 14.7b. There's some other effects here. When the French first enter Moscow or St. Petersburg, they will get an extra combat command for the rest of the game. But if they leave those cities, then they'll lose it. And there's markers to track these special circumstances. And there may not be enough markers for everything. If I start blowing bridges or something, hey, I'm going to have to come up with new markers. Okay, and whoever has the most combat commands gets to must declare his attack first. And you again alternate your attacks back and forth here. When you declare an attack, you must spend at least one combat command, but you could spend more than that. And what you do is you're going to roll a die, and if you get a natural 1, your attack's been aborted. And the combat commands you spent are lost, and you're just screwed. Otherwise, what you're going to do is you're going to add your combat commands that you allocated, plus the combat rating, the number on your leader, to the die roll. And if you manage to roll a 7 or higher, you get to make the attack. Some uncertainty as to whether or not you actually launch the attack. If the attack goes forward, you're then allowed to declare supporting stacks to be joining the attack. If a supporting stack wants to join, you make a test just like the other roll, but you get to use the same combat command points that you used to launch the original attack for this. Each stack is checked individually, and none of them are going to abort the attack. If you fail the roll, well, those guys just didn't go in. Then the defending player can call on friendly stacks that are adjacent to the defending stack to support. If he wants to do so, he can allocate combat command points up to whatever he has left, and then makes a roll and adds the same modifiers there for his for his attempt to get in there. He'd be adding the combat commands and the combat rating, etc. And he's again trying to get a 7 to get his supporting stacks into play. I don't think there's a 1. I don't think there's an effect to a 1 for that. You might be able to force a success. Then after the combat's completely resolved, the guy who didn't just declare a combat has the opportunity to declare one at that point. If you fail to declare an attack, if you decide to pass on an attack opportunity, or if you fail to go in through a die roll, but not an abortion, noted here, that's out of the errata. If you just fail because you didn't get your successful die roll, but you didn't roll a 1, then you're done declaring attacks for that turn. You will not be allowed anymore. The same stack can be ordered to attack as many times as the player wishes, and you could shift back and forth away from that stack to go fight somewhere else and then make another attack with it. Once both players are unable to attack anymore, this section's done. Now I'm going to take a little break because the combat is, as I said, very different from everything else. I don't want to call it very unique again, and I didn't want to just say unique because there's a pride issue in this all or something. Okay, well, we're going to have to swap batteries again, but so the combat is essentially adding up the combat factors of units. Remember, each unit has one combat factor. The numbers on the units are just their stacking value, and that limits the number of combat factors you can have in a hex. And you're going to be adding up the total number of combat factors in the attacking and defending stack. Ignore the supporting units for now. And if you have multiple different attacking types, you get a bonus to your strength. If you ended up force marching, or if you attacked earlier in the turn, you're going to get divided. Your units are fatigued. They're not capable of fighting. You get penalties here running for different terrain in play. You add the combat rating of the leader. Now, the base game is just any leader, but you have to use specific leaders in the advanced roles based on who can command the most troops. Then your supporting stacks are going to provide a bonus equal to the number of units there. Well, that's kind of the number of combat factors, right? So, plus, if you have any commander, you get a bonus there. And you get some penalties still if you're facing supporting unit, if supporting units are facing certain terrain problems. And then you add a die to it. This is the attacker's value. The defender's value is going to be the combat factors of the defending units, modifier for multiple, combined arms bonus, and you can see that, or not multiple, but additional value, that gets doubled if you've got all three types in there. Marching effects. The combat rating of the leader, and then your supporting units that are involved as well, plus a die. Okay, well, you make a comparison, and we don't have the results there. Now, if I'm going to have to do this, let me see. Combat factors rule 3.3. Let's make sure I understand this. Yeah, each unit has a combat factor of 1. So the supporting stacks don't really have... I don't know why they're broken out quite the way they are. I had gotten a different feeling from it. Like, well, why is it combat factors here instead of combat factor? Why is this not combat factors? What's the difference? Maybe this is an artifact of prior versions of the rules or something. Whoever has the higher total won the battle. If the scores are tied, the stacks stay in the hex they were in, and the attacker takes a hit. If the defenders win, the attacker stays in the hex they're in. The defender has the option to remain or to withdraw. If the defenders withdraw, they stay stacked together and retreat into an adjacent hex. They can't withdraw across an unbridged river or into difficult terrain, but realize the Russians can withdraw into forest mountains and rough because they don't treat them as difficult terrain. You can't go into an enemy unit. You can't go into a hex adjacent to the stack which actually initiated the attack, but you can go into hexes that are adjacent to the supporting. And you have to stay within the hex capacity, which means you can't overstack into a friendly stack. There will be additional consequences to a withdrawal. We'll get to that in a moment. If the attacker wins and he has 3 or more points higher than the defender, the defending forces have to withdraw, and they're eliminated if they're not able to. The attacking units then have, if they're undisrupted, have an option to advance. If he's just 1 or 2 points over the defender, then the defending stack has the option to remain or withdraw. If they withdraw, undisrupted cav in the attacking stack, only the cav have the option to advance after combat. The advance can only be done with the actual attacking stack. Only the defending stack itself actually retreats. The supporting stacks aren't affected by that. If all the defending units are eliminated, any undisrupted units in the attacking stack may advance Okay, the difference between the two values is going to be the number of hits that the winning stack does on the losing stack. But this can't exceed the total number of undisrupted combat units that the winning side had before the battle started. The number of hits the losing side inflicts on the winning side will be half that difference, rounded down. Adjusted by a d6, a roll of 1 or 2 subtracts 1, a roll of 5 or 6 adds 1. But the adjusted total result can't exceed the number of undisrupted units. So you can't hurt the enemy if you don't have any undisrupted units. If the defending stack withdraws or is forced to do so, and the attacking stack has undisrupted cav, and the defending stack has none or one disrupted defending unit, they suffer an additional hit. I'm sorry, let me see. And the defending stack has none or one disrupted defending unit suffers an additional hit and is eliminated. No. If he has none, one disrupted defending unit suffers the hit. Yeah, I had trouble reading that the first time, even before doing it on camera. I'm not sure quite why. I put a lot of questions on it, you can see. We're going to have to swap batteries, though. Owning player allocates the hits. They have to take at least half of them to units in the attacking or defending stack, with remainder being allocated to supporting stacks. Any unit that takes a hit gets disrupted, or if it's already disrupted, then it'll be eliminated. If the stack takes an odd number of hits, the owning player can choose to allocate an extra hit so they don't end up with a disrupted unit out of it. They can sacrifice a unit fully if they wish. And you can take your hits wherever you like. You don't have to take all your hits on the undisrupted units. You can wipe out the disrupted stuff. Although the disrupted units don't take part in the combat directly, they will take casualties, or can. And then we have the restrictions on losses, again, kind of repeated. If all friendly combat units in a hex with a commander is eliminated, the commander is going to have to make the die roll for casualty, which other circumstances can do. On a 1, he's eliminated. Otherwise, he gets to slip away up to 3 hexes distant. Okay. Then, let's go back to the sequence of play. After the combat phase, we have this special commander's movement phase, where commanders are allowed to move 3 hexes. These are commanders that may have moved during the strategic movement. This is the if you have commanders alone, or commanders who aren't with moving units, this is the only way they can move to reposition their commands. Then the Russian player rolls a die for each non-city hex in Russia occupied by single French combat units. So you don't want to spread out, but you don't want to stay stacked together because you're going to suffer attrition losses from that. But if you do spread out and the Russians roll a 6 or a 5 or 6 after turn 7, the unit takes a hit, becoming disrupted or eliminated. And then any reinforcements happen at the end of the turn specified on the table, which is a little opposite of every other game that you ever play. The reinforcements, instead of coming at the beginning of the turn, show up at the end. Okay. And they give rules on where they show up. Well, they show up where you'd expect. The Russians have a bunch that come in Kiev, which you might not expect. A bunch of forces coming from the south. Then we have the setup rules, which I've mostly followed. There's historical setup and then a free setup option. I wanted to do the historical because, I don't know, I don't think it makes much difference with me. But at least it gives me some clue of where I should have, where is a reasonable place to have things set up. Okay, what are the victory conditions? Well, if Napoleon's killed, the Russians win, and they win big. Otherwise, it's going to be determined by the victory points. And each player has cities. Basically, if you hold your own cities, you get the victory points for them. If you hold somebody else's cities, you get the victory points for them. And that's pretty much how it works. And it gives a compendium of how much the cities are worth. The Russians start with a track of victory points as well to mark the decisive victories that have happened in the battle. Every time the Russians lose a decisive battle, they're going to lose a victory point. Every time they gain one, they gain one. They start off at the top of their chart, though, and they can't get higher. And I believe you can't go below 1, but maybe it's 0. And you're going to add up the number of cities you have, plus the modifier for the Russians, and whoever has the most points wins. That will be at the end of the 16th turn, but the same victory conditions work if you go into 1813. So, onto the optional rules, random events. Before the game starts, we kind of unstack the deck. We're going to have 2 sets of random events, one for the first half of the game, essentially one until turn 8, and then the other for the rest of the game. Now, I believe you leave, I think turn 8 is the split to where this gets flipped over if need be. It might be turn 9 if you decide to go to the 1813 scenario. Each turn before general supply and attrition, each player draws a card from the top of the deck. If it is not split into 2 sections, it's an autoplay, and you must play it at that point, and it takes its effect, and you have no choice in the matter. Otherwise, each player has to play a card, and the Russian must pick his card first in the first 8 turns, and then the French does on the rest. You play for the side that you're indicated. By the way, here's one that's a must play. You play for the side indicated, so if the Russian played this, he'd get this effect. If the French played it, he'd get this effect. You can see there's additional supply trains. Those just get added to your pool for the rest of the game. Okay. Commander capability. Here, we're worried about individual core commands. Some of the commands are going to be marked with kind of a colored notation on them with the core. If they're marked just with a core without the colored notation, then that's just for historical use. We also have leaders who have an A, I, or C on them. For example, Napoleon has an A. He's the overall commander. Grouchy is counted as a C, as is Marat, which make them overall cav commanders. They can command cav from anything and put it together as they like. Likewise, there's the senior infantry commanders who can do the same. And then there's the corps commanders, which I pointed out with the color. All combat units have their corps designation on them, and that'll help tell who they belong with. Guards can be commanded by anything, any commander to which this rule applies. You can put them into a corps or whatever. You don't have to worry about it, and they will count for it. The Russians have 3 commanders marked I, and that'll be Bagration, Barclay d'Italia, and Tormasov. They can only affect their own army. So Bagration, I believe, is the 2nd army, and that's indicated by a little 2 there. Barclay's 1st army, Tormasov has to be 3rd army. So when a stack of units, basically, if you're commanded by the correct one of the correct leaders, as described above, like an overall infantry commander and you're all infantry or something, you'll get this advantage. When a stack undertaking strategic move is accompanied by a commander who's able to command all of the units, the stack gets a -1 for its force march table. In combat, the command rating applied will be that of the commander who's able to command the greatest number of combat units, which obviously is going to be the overall commander, but if there's a tie, it goes by rank: overall commander, senior commander, the IC, and then finally down to a corps commander, who are considered the lowest ranked people. We get some additional units deployed for additional corps commands. Many of them are not terribly good that would be added, but they have their own specific things. Some commanders are going to have special circumstances surrounding them, and they'll have some kind of symbol on them. For example, Napoleon has a couple of stars on him, which means something. Okay. The little yellow triangle here, like Bagration has, that's because before Kutuzov takes over the command, Bagration, Barclay, and Tormasov are penalized if they're stacked together. They'll have a CR of 0 each, and they will never combat support each other. Constantine, maybe he's not on the board yet, I don't know, is got a problem where he has to roll when he tries to move. With strategic movement, if he gets a 1 or 2, he fails. Platov gets to increase the combat factors of each cavalry unit he has by 1 that he's stacked with. Okay, Napoleon and Davout give a -1. Yeah, I knew Davout had this, not the other one. Have a -1 to their strategic movement force march roll. Napoleon also gives +1 for each unit, each combat factor that he has in good order with which he's stacked, up to a maximum of 3 extra combat factors. Murat gives a +1. He's got this kind of, it's a down triangle. A +1 to any units which he does strategic movement for, which means he's bad at force marching, and that's because he really mismanaged the supply of the Cav reserve. And you'll see how badly, because there's more rules for that. However, Murat and Grouchy add 1 combat factor to each good order Cav unit in their stack. Okay, in addition, before Kutuzov takes over, all the Russian commands, when they try to move, make a roll, and on a 1 or 2 they fail. Constantine does this in addition to his normal roll for that, so he's really unlikely to get moving. Okay, special rules on Cav. So Napoleon started the attack fairly early, June. That doesn't sound that early, but in Russia, summer comes late, I guess. And there wasn't enough forage. And that caused additional problems, which means whenever the attrition takes place, it says 8.5, that may be just the force march attrition. Yeah, that's the force march attrition. Whenever that takes place, you have to take the casualties on Cav first. Okay. 1 or 2 Cav units must be disrupted or eliminated in preference to infantry. At the start of the game, there's a Cav reserve, which is kind of back here under Grouchy and Murat. At the end of the general supply and attrition phase of the first 2 turns, the French roll a die, and they lose that many divisions, picked by the Russians, which means the best horses die first. Or the worst ones die first, and the best ones get worse. In addition, if you only killed 4 or less of those, or 5 through 7 of them, you're going to have less supply trains, because the idea is, had Napoleon actually managed to get that whole Cav reserve into Russia, feeding them would have been a continuous nightmare, and he might have been better off having gotten Murat to kill them off for him. Okay, political roles. These are kind of what-ifs, but we're going to play with them. They give some more strategic options to the players, and, well, maybe they'll get triggered, maybe they won't. So one is that the Russians might have, or the territory in the Ukraine might have revolted against Russia. This is recently conquered Polish territory. The French have already created the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and obviously there's the hope that the revolutionary fervor is going to move into Russia. Well, in order to do this, the first turn that a unit of Poniatowski's 5th Corps occupies Kiev, you roll a d6 to see if a rising happens on a 3 through 6 at any time up to and including turn 5, and a 5 or 6 on turn 6 through 9 means that there will be one, and Tormasov's 3rd Army is taken out of the play because they'll be suppressing the revolt. If that uprising happens at the start of the following turn, the French can declare independence for the Western territories, which will make any city in Western Russia, and they set a line of hexes from 1317 is down here going north, but excluding the area north of the river Dvina. It has to be this. Okay. Will be considered to be friendly to the French and unfriendly to the Russians once they're occupied. And they'll maintain that allegiance to the end of the game. But the other problem is the French have to take every objective hex in the game to win, if that's the case. Which does not sound like a good move. So you may not want to trigger the uprising. The Austrians tried to avoid fighting. They may only attack if stacked with non-Austrian units. If they're attacked, they can defend. Once the campaign was clearly a failure, many foreign contingents started withdrawing from La Grande Armée. How's this going to be handled? Unless the French occupy Moscow and or St. Petersburg, at the start of each turn, beginning with turn 11, one foreign contingent combat unit is removed from play at the Russian player's choice. Now, these are going to be based on the coloring of the force here, and there's something in the beginning that helps show those. We'll worry about it when we get to it. Sweden might have also come in. The Russians had actually just concluded a war with Sweden over Finland, but it's possible, given Bernadotte's eventual entry into the coalition, that it might have been triggered earlier. In order to do this, at the end of turn 6, the Russians roll a die. If they roll a 4, 5, or 6, the Swedes come in with a small force at St. Petersburg. Okay. Next option. How's my... Okay. Just checking the batteries on that. So, once the French... at the earlier of the end of the first turn that the French have 8 depots deployed, or the completion of turn 7, whichever one comes first, the French can declare that they're going to winter quarters. If they do so, they're not going to play out this game. They're going to flip it over, hopefully after removing the counters, and play out an 1813 scenario instead. Now, the effects of doing so is we're not going to have to deal with winter rolls. The two armies go into winter quarters. All French disrupted units are returned to good order. All units move to friendly cities or unfriendly but occupied by a depot. Reinforcements that the French were getting that are due to them later in the year come in the interphase. The French can take one city or an unfriendly one, one friendly city or an unfriendly one occupied by a depot, and designate it as their new ultimate supply source, giving them a shorter supply chain to go deeper into Russia. A friendly city remains the unlimited supply source until it's occupied by the Russians. But the French are going to still take attrition during the winter. They roll 2d6, have that result, rounding down, and lose that many combat units. But it looks like they get to choose it. Commanders are removed if a 1 is rolled. 2 commanders if 2 1s are rolled, i.e. you didn't lose many units at all. Foreign contingents must be taken first before French or Polish. Probably should apply that same thing here, that the Russians can't pick the Poles off because they were really quite loyal to this attack. French also rolls a die to see what happens with Napoleon. On a 1 or a 2, he leaves the game permanently, going back to France. On a 5 or a 6, he stays with the army. On a 3 or 4, he goes back to France, but might show up again, and at the end of each turn, he's going to roll, and on a 5 or 6, he comes back. Now, for the Russians, they undisrupt. Their units can take positions anywhere on the board, subject to being in winter supply, which is just the depots, right? I think. says, it doesn't give me the hint towards that. It says Rule 6.2 final bullet. Yeah, that's not helpful. As long as they're not immediately adjacent to a French unit or in a city downstream from a newly established French USS. So, for example, if this became my new unlimited supply source, this whole waterway is now cleared by the French, and I can't set up Russians along it to block it. The Russians roll 2 dice, have the score, and restore that many units, which were removed from play in 1812. These can be deployed in or immediately adjacent to their key cities. The Russians also get some reinforcements, which I believe match the ones they haven't got on the board. But I'm not sure, because they do have some extra units here, which might be coming in. And then you start the next turn 8 on the next year instead of picking it here, and that will be in May. And then the game continues until turn 16 in September of 1813. There's different charts for the 1813 supply situation that you have to worry about. The idea here is that the French aren't going to get any reinforcements because they're still fighting a war in Spain, and that's not going to get any better. Let's see. There's a card that gets removed from play. The first deck gets shuffled into the second deck in this case, which is different from the other because we're not dealing with the winter necessarily. French foraging won't happen in turns 8 or 9. Okay. The Russians. At the end of each turn, the Russians roll a die, and a score of 1 or 2 has no effect. 3, 4, or 5 restores a 1-unit command or combat, which was removed from play in 1812. And on a 6, I think they get 2 units. Doesn't look like they get to touch the extra units that they have here, and our battery is almost dead. It looks, though, like there's nothing but examples, so I just want to take a couple of words to talk about the design notes here, which I'll probably touch in the review. It's very nice. These are written by the designer himself and go a long way to kind of explaining at least his viewpoint, both in the historical and in the game design notes. I don't usually... So historical notes are kind of a weird thing, because unless they're written by the designer, sometimes they just don't mesh with the game at all. Sometimes you're playing the game and you're like, well, this is completely opposite to the notes. I found this quite often with the old S&Ts, was somebody would write the main article who was not the author of the game, and you just felt like, the game was not matching the historical narrative that was given forth. They might both be reasonable interpretations, but if they don't match, it doesn't really belong with that game. But in this case, the designer himself wrote the historical summary. That always makes me a little happier. And he also wrote an extensive design section, designer's notes, which gives some insight into, some of the decisions he made. All right, we're going to send this one up.